Rise of the Dictionaries II. This is about the aftermath of the development of dictionaries and what happens to us when we start regarding us being English speakers, what happens when we start regarding the written language as more authoritative than the spoken language and ascribing to it its particular esteem. You'll remember we've had a tour in another video of a range of early proto-dictionaries and dictionaries. And it's time now to talk about some of the habits involved in those dictionaries. One of the quirks of lexicographers is that they care a lot about where words come from. You remember the first dictionaries are entirely about where words come from. Hard Latin words that come into English make those hard word lists, and obscure words used by semi-secret parts of the society make the thieves' cant dictionaries. Nathaniel Bailey's first dictionary is an etymological dictionary of English. It's principally concerned with explaining where the words come from and secondarily concerned with saying things about what they mean. Presumably you're looking up because you care something about, because you already know the word that is. It isn't until Samuel Johnson comes along that the emphasis comes to be on semantics. The emphasis is really on meanings. But all of these people still care about where the words come from, and as they make choices about how to spell things, sometimes they refer to the origin in order to adapt the spelling. And here's a pair of words where this happens in a really obvious way. Middle English had the word debt, which came from French dette, and it means the same thing that the modern English word debt does. But when dictionary makers wanted to put it in their dictionaries, they looked at the array of spellings that they had available and decided that the most common spelling, D-E-T-T-E or D-E-T-T, simply wouldn't do. They wanted to put a B in it. Why did they want the B? Because they knew that it came ultimately from Latin debo debito, meaning to well, debo and debito, both of which have to do with owing things. If you speak Spanish, you'll recognize that that's used metaphorically now. Debo means I must, I should, I ought to. So why is the B there? It's there because it made the lexicographers happy, because it had been there in Latin. Why don't we pronounce the B? Because we have never pronounced the word debt in English any other way than debt. Unless you read Shakespeare in Holofernes and Love's Labour Lost, who's really a pedantic jerk, throws kind of a tirade about one of the other characters, and he preaches that you really ought to pronounce it debit. But Shakespeare's holding this person up for ridicule. Clearly, there have always been people who think you should pronounce all the letters, but the letters aren't necessarily there to be pronounced. The same thing happens with doubt, which also some semantic change. In Middle English, it often meant fear, but doubt has a B in it. And why did the lexicographers put the B in there, or choose the less common spelling that had a B in there to enforce and normalize in their publications? Well, it's there in Latin, that's why. And of course you'll notice that, remember, Latin's always there for English. We have relatives of these words. We have cognates that are borrowed directly from Latin, like a debit card or a debit on your accounts list, or indubitable, for example. These words are also part of English, but none of them really implies that this word debt or this word doubt ought to be written with a B. There's no great reason to do this. This is just an etymological gesture that was added to the word, and that's why those letters are silent. However, well, we'll get to the however. The same thing happens with recetta in Middle English, which once the vowel shifts becomes receipt, and we spell it with a P. Why? Well, because it ultimately comes from Latin capio, capere, cepicaptus, and so we had better put the P in there, don't you see? It comes from receptus, and that's, there are some other versions, there's some other changes in there, but it's related to the word receptive, where we do say it. The spelling's simply etymological. Nobody has ever said receipt, not properly anyway. By by the way, do notice, this is an aside, if you're interested in Latin etymologies, in how Latin words have worked up into English, notice that a lot of our words are based on parts of the verb that are not the infinitive or the first person present tense, which is what capio is, and the infinitive is capere. Often they come from participles, and captus is the past participle. There are a variety of reasons for this, and there's not a lot of consistency, but it's a fact, and you may enjoy that. So what happens if people do pronounce some of those letters that are artificially added? And in fact, then we pronounce them, and we have words where that happened. This word parfait is a good Middle English word. It's still a current pronunciation in many varieties of British English, and it comes from French, from a word that looks a lot like that in Old French. Of course, it's now spelled and pronounced perfect. And why should the C be there? Well, because it comes from a Latin past participle, perfectus, which means totally done, really carried through to its end, completed, and therefore excellent. That's what perfect means. Why was the C put in there? Dictionary makers wanted to show off that they knew the Latin. They thought that was to make the language a little bit orderly. It seemed like the sensible way to spell the word, but it had never been pronounced that way until some time, and this is key, until sometime after people began to lean on and trust dictionaries as guides to pronunciation. This is something that can only happen through schooling. It's the popularity of schooling and increasing literacy, and eventually the cultural force of universal schooling that allows books to have this particular prestige that influences people to do things like pronounce perfect when their parents and grandparents and communities had always said perfect. This is called a spelling pronunciation, and you'll detect it done erroneously sometimes. Of course, now perfect has become the ordinary and correct pronunciation. Spelling pronunciation can take hold and become the new tradition. We see that happening in various ways. Middle English falcon, which comes from French, a word pronounced more or less similarly, becomes falcon, and here we have it in Shakespeare. This is about Duncan from Macbeth, a falcon towering in her pride of place, and it comes from Latin falcon, with an ending there. Another etymological spelling that we've come to pronounce, but notice that the moral of this story is we can use this comparison of pronunciations to observe a cultural change. Through the Enlightenment and through the growth of mass schooling and mass literacy in the 18th and 19th centuries, the written word starts to become more authoritative culturally than the spoken word is, and people began to trust spelling as a guide to pronunciation rather than their pronunciation as a guide to spelling. We see that evidence of that in the way that a newfangled spelling, which borrows from ancient history, falcon, comes to influence people's pronunciation. The same thing happens with Arctic. Lots of people say Arctic today, and it only came to be spelled Arctic in the 1700s, again as people began to look back to Latin and then to Greek, Arcticus and Arctos, where Greek means the Greek Arctos means bear, because of course it's Ursa Major, it's the Big Dipper that gives you a guide to point to the North Star, and the North Star is the tail of the Little Dipper, Ursa Minor, the Little Bear constellation. By the way, if you want to go all the way back to Indo-European, Ursa in Latin is related to Arctos. This whole Arctic business is borrowed from Greek to Latin, through French to English, and then Arctic is borrowed, the spelling Arctic is borrowed back out of Latin. Ursa gives us the wonderful little girl's name, Ursula, which means little bear. It's so cute. I don't know where it gets its scary connotations these days. Thanks, Disney. Oh, I need to go to my correct keyboard and go to the next one. Now, the whole idea of providing etymological spellings is good, clean fun, but sometimes even lexicographers can be misled. And here we've got an array of interesting errors. Island is very familiar, and the silent S in island trips people up all the time. We wonder why it's there. And in fact, if you trace the real etymology of this word back, it goes to Old English eland, where e means water. It actually shares Indo-European origins with the French word eau and the Spanish word agua. So this is eland. That's what an island is. It's land out in the water. That makes plenty of sense. So why is the S there? It's thanks to the influence of isle. And by the way, the S in isle probably shouldn't be there either, because it's Middle English île, which, it's unshifted in Middle English, from Old French île, which is the same as modern French île, which the scholars knew came from Latin insula. So why don't we just go ahead and put the S back in isle? And while we're at it, let's pretend that island comes from the same place and stick the S in there. Ridiculous. Scythe is an interesting one. Of course, this is the tool for reaping grain or for mowing hay. That's become associated with death through the image of the Grim Reaper. In Middle English and Old English, it's seethe, and there's a beautiful vowel shift there, right? The great vowel shift turns it to scythe, so no problem. Interestingly, Samuel Johnson in his dictionary keeps the Middle English spelling. He sticks to the etymological spelling, but the other dictionary writers just made some assumptions that it was related to words like shear and Latin scindere, which has to do with cutting, and put the C in it because of a false etymology, because of some misled ideas about where the word came from and what it was related to. And we get even more chaos in a word like anthem, which in Middle English was antem, and Old English was anteven. French mixes in there in a way I'm not going to unpack here. You can read all about it in the OED. From Latin antifona. This is modern English antiphon. Antiphon, sorry. So what we've got here, changing the N to an M in anthem, and also supplying the H in anthem, is probably the word hymn, which is a good old word. It's been pronounced hymn since time out of mind. It goes all the way back through Latin and Greek to hymnos. But hymns there all the time, and through some sort of folk etymology or assumptions about relationships between these words for liturgical music, anthem, which had been pronounced antem, picked up an H and it picked up an M, and even until, and it picked up, once the H was there, here's another stage of spelling pronunciation. People who encountered this word mainly in writing, mainly visually that is, saw the TH and read it as a TH, anthem, even though up through the 18th century, careful speakers and teachers emphasized that it ought to be pronounced antem or antum, not anthem. But here we are. Language will change whether we like it to or not, and once a literate form of the language, once the written language is part of the mix, it will carry its own weight in these processes of change. The idea of spelling pronunciation has a new currency now, thanks to the shape of modern pedagogy. So, having followed that link, we get to some modern people, contemporary modern people, talking about their ideas of how spelling and pronunciation ought to relate to one another. Now, this isn't a representation of a carefully researched pedagogical theory, although I'm sure there's plenty of pedagogical research on the relationship between spelling. I'm not an education major, so I'm not going to comment on it, but I'm curious about how the so-called science of reading movement would treat this. It'd be fodder for an interesting discussion. Here we've got somebody preaching and, yes, also selling materials for using pronunciation to reinforce correctly spellings, and it's premised on the assumption that pronouncing words incorrectly makes spelling more difficult. If you've been following the history of the language, you know that it's not really pronouncing words incorrectly that makes spelling more difficult. It's really the fact that spelling stabilized 500 years ago that makes relating the spellings to our continuously changing pronunciation much more difficult. I would defy this person to find a good way to spell to relate the sounds in one O-N-E to its letters in a useful way for a kid, or teach a kid to think of the 6 different sounds that O-U-G-H can spell. Those are cases where careful pronunciation provides absolutely no help in spelling, particularly if you know that a hiccup is a hiccup and not a hic cough. So we find this person telling us that we should never say different or interest, that we really ought to be pronouncing interest. And of course, regional accents are a problem for this person. Now, if this person skirts some difficulties, if we wanted to talk about this, in a live classroom, I'd ask questions about how accents could work how accents work in a spelling classroom. For example, if you've got kids of different socioeconomic backgrounds and of course different racial backgrounds, they're going to have different speech varieties, and judgments about which ones are helpful and unhelpful to have are going to be fraught. Silent letters, yes, we've got them, that's fine. There's an irony here. We're warned to observe these silent letters and never say the C in scissors, and never say the T, I presume, in thistle, which is a good idea, or the D in Wednesday, which is a good idea. But here we've got a guide with a freaky looking emu staring at us about the wrong and the right way to spell words, and this person's opposed to saying government or Arctic in particular. Of course, if you'll click on this, you'll hear this pronunciation. Can we hear it?
Arctic. Arctic.
Oh, good grief. That's just almost painful.
Triathlon. Triathlon.
Really? The epenthetic A in triathlon is really so ordinary it ought to be unremarkable. It's certainly not as contentious as nuclear. So there you go. We've got an interesting problem here, though, with this educational blogger is on a bandwagon, and not a rare bandwagon that says, aha, we really ought to be trusting the spelling as a guide to pronunciation, and we ought to be carefully modifying our pronunciation in order to reflect the correct spelling. Where does this leave us? Why should we be imitating the spelling of 500 years ago in our pronunciation? I'm not sure I know how to answer that question. And it could well be that spelling reform is needed, but the obstacles to spelling reform are so incredible. I shouldn't say incredible, they're so great that they must be insurmountable unless we face some sort of cataclysmic disruption and have to rebuild literacy from scratch someday. There you go. Spelling pronunciation. Sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's not. And if anyone says that spelling makes sense or that there's a way to understand how spelling works, ask them to explain the pronunciation and the spelling of the word one, as in the number 1, and then step back, or 8 for that matter, which you now can do, and then step back and snicker until they get it done. Maybe saying something convincing, you just never know.